The number one thing that I have people focus on first is really that unlearning, that mindset training that needs to occur. And I feel like going back to your example of an agent, that's really where Gen AI right now provides a great opportunity for us to get out of our heuristics. It's one of the reasons why, as you know, we can even go back to looking at, we'll say, the touting of Web3 a few years ago. We saw models such as DAOs still be centralized because people couldn't move beyond the heuristics of the centralized business models.
Hey folks, before we get started with the show, I wanted to offer you the chance potentially of a lifetime. If you're looking to get your brand in front of the boldest thinkers in business, this is the place to do it. The Unlearn podcast is downloaded in over 85 countries with a growing audience of over 100,000 listeners per month. That includes C-suite leaders, startup founders, and executives from Fortune 500 companies to scaling startups. We're ranked in the top 1% of business podcasts on Spotify and Apple across multiple regions. But our listeners just don't stream, they stick around, with 85% completing the entire show on their first listen. If your brand wants to align with bold ideas, breakthrough thinking, and a global audience that's not afraid to challenge the startup quo, get in touch. For the first time ever, we're offering sponsorship opportunities on the show, and we'd love to have you with us. Enjoying the podcast? Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. This way, you won't miss any episode, and it greatly supports our podcast. Today's guest is someone who doesn't just think about the future, she builds it and helps us transform into it. Ja-Naé Duane is a systems thinker, innovator, and author of the powerful new book, Super Shift. Now, I've known Ja-Naé for a number of years as co-faculty at Singularity University, where she's constantly bringing her expertise in behavioral science and technology to help people adapt and transform to the changing world that we're in. In her new book, she sets out a bold vision for shaping the future of the world from the rise of AI, climate disruption, and reimagining how we govern, work, and relate to one another. This isn't just a talk of transformation. She gives lots of different models to help people use and change in new ways that they don't expect. We dive into her examples of her transformation model and her future operating system model that can help leaders adapt and evolve. Get ready to unlearn the linear, siloed, and short-term world and step into a truly transformational, emergent future full of opportunity about how you can leverage this superintelligence to be more productive, to have a more holistic and enjoyable life, and also be inspired by nature. So let's get started with what was her core inspiration behind the book. It's great to have you back on the show. Obviously we've worked together for many years at Singularity University, which is always, for me, it's just such a great place to meet interesting folks doing hard things and certainly pushing knowledge forward in various different areas, whether it's biotech to technology to artificial intelligence now, which again, you and Steve have written this super book, Super Shifts, which is really diving deep and giving people loads of frameworks to think about the future of work around this super intelligence, I guess, that is starting to emerge. For you then, when you think about the work you've done over the last number of years, like why is this different? What was sort of the moment where maybe a penny dropped for you that you were like, oh wow, this is changing radically the way that I have worked in the past, and it means I need to approach things differently. What was the moment that sort of stood out to you?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Barry. And it's so nice to see you. I want to say that when we have crazy folks doing amazing, crazy things, it's nice to have a good community together to be able to support one another. To be honest, I have been thinking about this book, or at least elements of this book, for the past almost 7 years. It really was during COVID when I got a phone call from the center of the edge over in Europe, and they said, "Hey, Ja-Naé, we need to restart Europe." And we are working with about 30 different CEOs to figure out within this pandemic, everything shut down. How do we make this change and how do we really shift into what will feel like a new normal, but with folks who are unsure of what that looks like? And to me, that was really the penny drop. And I love the fact that you use that because as you and I know, we're coming out of this industrial revolution, the centralized models in which we've had for over the past 200 years. But to me, it was really this black swan event that allowed us to go, wait a minute, we can actually pause and say, what could be different here? What could we do that is new, or at least that we haven't experimented with? And how do we start to identify, based on both the weak and those strong signals on the horizon, of what is coming and how we can move forward with that? And it was those conversations during COVID where I started to then examine what are some models that we see in nature where, maybe they're decentralized systems, maybe they're more resilient models that also have the adaptability to really grow with stressors and have more symbiosis than we seem to have in our current systems. And that really began this evolution and exploration, if you will, with varying companies, CEOs, of what are some of these different models that we can really start to explore as we're thinking about this new age and really this age of intelligence that we're moving into. So it was a really life-changing opportunity and a fun opportunity to go, all right, people seem to be ready, so let's figure this out together.
Yeah, it's great, right? And like, there's a lot of examples that you use in the book of these paradigm shifts from ages to eras. I really like this idea, exploring micro histories, the transformative model, again, a tool that you've created to help people to do these deep changes. I definitely wanted to talk about this. And then probably, I think something that's really important for everybody is thinking about a future operating system, right? So how do you create a systemic approach to deal with this work and the way that we're going to change? So talk to us then a little bit, right? You're doing this. You've a great opportunity to work with a very prestigious agency here in Europe to think about how to drive this work through. I like the idea as well that you're talking about this idea of putting stressor on the system to help it to evolve. I think that's one of these very interesting things, as you say. It's in nature, it's in biology. I think a lot of the biohackers are all of simple examples, like making people fast, just put stress on your system to help the cells essentially reproduce in a better manner. So this notion is sort of something I'm hearing a little bit more and more in all aspects of life, if you will, and work. So tell us a little bit of some of the things that you had to unlearn as you started to dive into this idea of super shifts, but maybe the super intelligence that we're starting to have access to through these sort of large learning models and generative AI.
I'm still exploring because it's not something I have fully figured it out for myself. Are those stressors? So I want to touch upon this for a bit. We as a society have become way too comfortable. you know, we get our food delivered to us. We put ourselves in echo chambers where we're not having conversations with individuals who maybe have even a slightly different opinion. And so we're constantly surrounding ourselves with too much of a positive feedback loop, if you will. And because of the fact that we are so comfortable, we we almost forget what it's like, even from a primal perspective, to have those stressors that allow us to evolve. And so, one of the things that I've had to unlearn really was how comfortable have I made myself?
Yeah, it is a great point. Yeah. Yeah, it resonates massively. I was talking to a good friend of mine the other day, and he was sort of putting this idea out there as if all these comforts sort of went away, if the electricity suddenly didn't work, how many people could survive? How many people could like farm? How many people could create food for themselves? How many people could hunt and gather, right? Like to your points of these sort of primal instincts and skills, is that there's a danger that they're being lost, and they're certainly not in the curriculum to be taught in many ways. It's a great insight. Yeah. So tell us more about as you've sort of went on that journey.
So it's really interesting, and I want to touch on curriculum and unlearning in a bit, because I think that that's extremely important as we think about even our own curricular, the curriculum that we create for ourselves within our lives, right? For myself, I realize that there are so many needs to identify physical stressors. So the way that I work, as particularly as an introvert, and everyone's different. As a behavioral scientist, one of the things I've learned about myself is that I'm way too much in my head. And and I'm very kinesthetic, so I need those physical stressors in order to process things more quickly. And so one of the things I'm working on right now is more of physical training and climbing mountains, and really pushing myself in a way physically that I've never done in my life. But what's been really lovely about that is that I start to see the connections between the lessons that I'm learning on the trail and the lessons that I'm learning in, say, conversations, or maybe in some of my work relationships. And so everything's really transferable as far as how I'm approaching situations. What are some of the triggers, either for, we'll say, my good behavior, or or my behavior I want to get rid of. But that self-awareness is more prevalent for me. And so I don't know about yourself. Have you really dug into any type of physical training in that way?
This is really interesting to me, right? Like one of the things I'm sort of constantly thinking about is systems. Like I love systems. That's why I'm also excited to talk about the transform model too as well. I really try to think about to get me at my. I'm not a big believer in this. Like I'm going to be 10 out of 10 every day. I like to be, if I can be 8 out of 10 consistently, I'm in a good place. And for me, a lot of these things are, some people have these things like the life wheel, or the work, my personal relationships, my friendship relationships, exercise, right? All of these things that I try to be somewhat intentional about, to be working on and be aware of. And I notice when I don't do certain things, the system sort of falls apart. Very classic example. When I first moved to Manila, we were building the early stage of the studio at that stage. It was about 12 months old. So I was just constantly on phone calls, like literally from please don't do this at home, but from like 6 a.m. until, midnight, whatever these things were, because we were trying to get the thing going. And it was very interesting to me is because I was on all these virtual calls all the time. And what happened is I started to sort of feel this frustration within me, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. And it was only when I was talking to one of my good friends, and she goes to me, "Oh, you sound lonely." And I was like, what the hell? And it was like, again, it was like one of these pennies dropped, because I became very aware that while I was spending talking to people, I was spending very little time in person with people. It was one of these things that really triggered me to your point before of an awareness of my behavior. So that's when I started to like really look back at, this system of work for me. So I did things like I instituted, having workouts 3 times a week. I lift weights. I book it like a meeting. It's a 90-minute session. I even hired a trainer to force me
Did
to
you
do it.
really?
Yeah, because it's easy for me to just sort of, if it was in my calendar, I found myself going, oh, I'll just do that email and I'll work out later. So I created these constraints, right? So I invested, if you will, in this sort of practice of having a trainer come and see me 3 times a week. I joined, I play rugby. So I joined a rugby club, a social team on a Wednesday. I go every Wednesday. I play with these people. I met loads of new people. We normally go for dinners and drinks afterwards. So there's a social activity with it, you know. These are just like little examples, and then try to join, let's call them more intellectually inspired communities. So maybe a startup group or whatever, where again, physically I have to leave my office and I have to go somewhere to be with people. And, you know, all of these things, again, they were, I'm hesitant to say massively on, like, obviously working out when my body is sore, as you know, climbing mountains is painful. But the breakthroughs for me were thinking about these things intentionally, you know, and I've got so much out of it. And I was trapped in this idea that productivity is doing, 12 Zoom calls a day and making progress on the thing rather than actually understanding like what's the systemic, if you will, view of what I need to be doing. And, you know, I'm better for it. There's no two ways about it. Right. And, you know, now I'm trying to, it's kind of funny, as we talk about this, I'm trying to build now an agent that forces me to do these things, like now starting to work on my diet, to work on it, like it knows my routine. So if I'm doing a workout, you know, what should I eat for breakfast that day? Like, so I'm really trying to play around and push this stuff. Hopefully I don't over optimize, but it's a fun experience to sort of go through this, if you will.
So I love the fact that you're using agents in that way, because I have an agent that I use to nudge me to meditate and reflect, because it's one of those things, to your point, right? If we have overemphasized the daily hustle, you know, and if you're an entrepreneur, look, you know this, I know this, you are going to grind. That is part, unfortunately, of
Yeah,
what
you can't take that away.
goes with it. Right, exactly.
Part
Like
of the stress.
that is
Yeah.
just a prereq if you want to go and start a business. However, what, you know, what's so hard, to your point, is sometimes getting away from that, right? Because you just go one more, you know, let me just do one more. And that one more ends up being then, you know, 12, 14 hours in, and then that ends up being months, sometimes years, depending on, you know, how long you're at it. But to be able to utilize, to know oneself, reflect, and say, these are the things that I need. How can I then create a system, maybe through an agent, to provide more of that accountability so that I can be more holistic about my approach to life, right? Because, I mean, I know you have kids, you know, I have a son. All these things that we do it to really create impact beyond ourselves. And if we're not there to enjoy it and we don't put those systems in place, then it's truly hard to then go, well, why did I do this? You know, what really was it all for? So I love the fact that you have a little agent that's keeping you on your toes.
Yeah, no, it's again, it's an experiment for me too as well, right? But again, the thing that I'm hearing a lot from what you're sharing too as well is that it is important to have these things, right? We're not just going to become these plugged into Neuralink beings, right? Where we're just sort of now part of the Matrix or the Borg, depending how you're seeing the future. But yeah, you know, we're still at the end of the day human, and that requires connections and reward from spending time with people, and that's something I've certainly definitely learned through this. All right, so tell me a little bit more then about like these ideas. Like we're sort of talking a little bit about the operating system, but I want to talk a little bit about some of these things that you're thinking to help people being inspired by nature, individuals, organizations, society. Talk a little bit about this transform model that you've created and how it can help people sort of as they're thinking about how to create this sort of life that they want in this age where we have this sort of super intelligence around us.
Yeah, you know, I feel like we are at this really lovely opportunity to start to identify some of these new models. And so the transform model is really almost a process model for individuals or organizations to utilize when rethinking sort of their systems of the future. So again, it could be very much utilized for the individual or for the organization. The number one thing that I have people focus on first is really that unlearning, that mindset training that needs to occur. And I feel like going back to your example of an agent, that's really where Gen AI right now provides a great opportunity for us to get out of our heuristics. It's one of the reasons why, as you know, we can even go back to looking at, we'll say, the touting of Web3 a few years ago. We saw models such as DAOs still be centralized because people couldn't move beyond the heuristics of the centralized business models. But to be able to use AI as an extension of one's own creativity and how one learns and thinks about these things can also help you identify where are some of the gaps in either your thinking, where are some of the weaknesses in the systems within your organization. And so one of the things that we do first is make sure that the mindsets of the individuals who are coming to the table have been combated with stressors. So we actually focus on an anti-fragile mindset because we want folks who will end up coming up against another black swan. I mean, that's inevitable. How do we make sure that they are getting out of that comfort zone and moving into an area within themselves where they embrace any type of change and adaptation that needs to occur as we're accelerating with our friend AI and other emerging technologies. So that's the number one thing that we end up starting with. And then from there, we start to move into different models, whether or not we're talking about business models or systems within the organization. Depending on where the weaknesses are, we look for where are the weaknesses within the system, where are the positive feedback loops that are just reiterating, right? I mean, climate, as we think about climate change here on Earth, like we have created this insular effect where we've actually overstimulated that positive feedback loop for the planet. And so, and we're doing that within our organizations as well, that we're constantly saying, yes, this is what we need to do. These are the products in which we need to produce. This is how we need to produce them in order to get shareholder value for that next quarter. And so moving away from that and going, okay, what are some ways in which we can take a holistic approach to our business model, maybe to our supply chain? How do we incorporate maybe a more regenerative process into how we source our materials? Maybe we are using technology to, instead of having such a broad supply chain, be able to compartmentalize that. What are ways in which we consider nature as well as a stakeholder within the organization who also needs to thrive, so that there is more of that symbiosis between nature, our businesses, our models between businesses and between our lives, really. And so it's these pieces that, you know, it started with a bunch of experimentation, and little by little, what we're seeing is that organizations are going, okay, I know that we still need to produce for shareholder value short term, but we also need to have a whole part of our organization that is thinking about how we make this shift and how we make this shift over the next 3 to 5 years. And so what's been really lovely has been, though I saw very much, and I'm interested in your perspective on this, I've seen a downshift since COVID in innovation within organizations, but I've seen more of an uptick in a want to include futures and foresight within an organization and identify what are these models. Because, as you know, as I know, technology is never going to be slower than it is today. Like, this is it. And as we look at that exponential curve, we are up against that curve. And so how do we make sure that we're really utilizing AI to really transform where we're heading? And so it's a really lovely partner as we're thinking about this more holistically, and include the planet in that approach as well.
One of the big things, especially with the technology shifts, I think many people really, really struggle with letting go of what they've always done and what has brought them success in the past, right? Like, I know you gave this little example of distributed organizations trying to organize in Web3 around DAOs, right? Which, again, is such a fundamental shift in, if you will, philosophy about deferring decisions to the group, which is sort of a version of democracy in some respects, but it's like codifying the policies and decision making and then letting the group decide, which sort of goes against, especially from an executive point of view, how many companies work, right? The leaders are there to make the decision inside many corporations. So it's a very interesting example of an idea that is very hard for people to grasp and very hard for them to enact, because it goes against all of their, if you will, self-being about why they have become, this senior person in a company. I've seen this, I guess, in many different cycles. In many ways, you said that's what inspired writing Unlearn. Is what I would see is that people are super smart. They never have a problem learning new skills. But yet when they're in a stressor situation, the default behavior is to go with something that they have done before rather than to embrace the unknown and do something that, to your point again, is uncomfortable, that is new, to try and get a breakthrough, And I can even think again about even writing Unlearn. Like, I'm dyslexic, so I've solid history of D-minuses in English. And yet, so, the whole notion about how you go about writing a book is people have that vision that you sit down, you write it, you type, and then magically a book appears. And none of that worked for me. But what did work for me was more being a little bit more unconventional, is like talking to someone about the ideas in the book, using AI to transcribe it and a copywriter to improve it. That was sort of not obvious to me, right? But as these technologies were becoming more robust, I still remember sitting down with my copy editor, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll record this." And then I send it off to someone who transcribes it and they send it back. And I was like, whoa, hang on a sec. We don't need to do that. Like, I have a transcription that just sits in the call with us and it'll be ready in 3. And I still remember his reaction at the time where, again, as a copy editor, his entire process for years had been recording the interview, sending the recording to someone, wherever they were, and they would type it up and send it back, And I was like, that even just that small example of using this sort of tool of if you will, like data and machine learning and what, he was sort of like, wow, that's amazing. I can start copy editing this almost instantly. I'm like, yes, why would we get another human in the loop here? So, like, it's so fascinating now as you extrapolate those ideas out even more. Right. Like, personally for me now, I'm getting to a point now. Some parts of me, I'm a little bit worried. Am I becoming almost too lazy? So, like, when I have to write emails now to people, I have, again, I use a tool to write it. It's called Superhuman. It's an email client that sits on top of Gmail.
Yeah. How
And
do
what
you
I
like it,
can,
by the way?
well, I'll share like some, like everything. There's pros and cons to it.
Yeah.
But if I share my little sort of lazy example, is I've got to a point now when I'm replying to emails, I just go, like, I basically bullet point out the reply. I don't thoughtfully write the whole email anymore. So I'd be like, I'd say we were organizing, to how we would do this podcast. I'd be like, yeah, hi Ja-Naé, yeah, 4 o'clock maybe on Wednesday could do it. Let's talk about these two things, and hope everything's going well. Like totally unstructured, loads of typos, like not really sitting down and writing the whole thing. And then I'll just hit the all right, clean up button with the AI, and it creates this perfectly drafted, email that I can sort of sense check and go, boom, gone. And again, for someone like me who, again, is dyslexic, so typos are a huge thing, grammar can be a huge thing. It at least creates my output quicker, right? And so it's one of these things, again, I'm finding these like small little optimizations, across my entire, if you will, like stack of tools that I use to help me do my work, cheaper, faster. And I don't know if better is the right line there. I think it's cheaper, faster, higher output. And so it's definitely something I'm wrestling with in terms of what this looks like is
Yeah, but okay, but Barry, let's talk about this for a minute. Think about the amount of time that it takes you to write emails, right? And just anyone to write emails, and how much time, just trying to I don't even want to say get to inbox zero. I mean, I will never get there. That's
no,
not
I've
that's not
given that
something
up.
I ever strive for. But what a lovely way to free up some of your time by having that augmentation. And what happens when we both have agents who are going to end up, whisper syncing with one another in a way that they just talk. We know, our agents know what we want them to say, they know what we want the outcome to be, and they figure it out and they schedule it and they just prep us for our conversation. How much time that will save us, and then we can decide or make what I consider a lovely, but I think almost harder choice of, okay, we've had this as an excuse, that we've had to work. We are now in many ways heading into this whole renaissance where our time is being freed up and we have to decide on how we want to spend it. And that, I think, scares so many people because it also means they have to reinvent. They have to unlearn what they've known, and then they have to reinvent how they decide to spend their time. And so I personally love that and fear that as a workaholic personally. So
I think it's a really important point because in the example even we're talking about here, the the promise of what's meant to be joyous and rewarding about work is the creative aspect of it, not the booking the meeting and scheduling the thing and that's sort of like, if you will, a transaction cost. What should be the most rewarding is actually doing the creative part of it, like creating the show as an example, right? Not scheduling to do the show. Again, one of these things that I'm finding more and more becomes interesting, and you've sort of hit the point to me, is you really have to be clear about what outcomes you want, what you value, how you want to work. So again, at the moment, there's still the human in the loop, me, especially you, where we sort of have to do some sort of sense making about like, what do you want to spend your time on? I'm hesitant to say a year, but maybe even a month now. You could sit down with your agent, because this is all I'm doing at the moment is I'm piling context into these agents and saying to them, actually what I like to do is I like to do podcasts towards the end of my week, where it's a fun thing for me to sort of creatively talk about ideas and share them. The early part of my week, I want to do deep work. If I have to write, I don't know, papers or strategies or right. So this sort of thing where you're then using these tools, if you will, as like a thought partner, where you're sort of teaching it like the things about how you want it to behave, how you want to behave ultimately. And again, that is kind of interesting to me, is as you do these context sort of sharings with this intelligence tool, Like that's what I'm actually finding very, very interesting. Because again, even when I write my lazy emails and I adapt it and tweak it, it just will learn more of my turn of phrase or my right. And again, it's sort of uncomfortable and you have to put time into it. But I absolutely agree. Most people are so busy doing what they're currently doing that the thought of stopping and taking a wholly different approach to using these tools to making them more efficient is just it's a cost most of them still aren't willing to pay. And I've also sat down with executives and said, look, this you invest in learning how to do this and you are going to get so much time back. But yet again, it's like the I'm too busy with the square wheel to make a round one type thing, and it's a very human reaction that it's not the first rodeo of this where I know people perform these behaviors. So, especially someone like you as a behavioral scientist, like what are those cues, right? Which maybe leads us into this future operating system idea. What are some of the things people can do to get them out of that sort of loop where they're not like sort of so busy doing what they're currently doing to actually create space to potentially change what they're doing?
Yeah. So even before I get to what they can do, I do want to say that they have been set up in such a way that the sunk cost of how they do things has been ingrained in them since they went off to elementary school. And so, to be able to step away from that after so many years invested feels counterintuitive to many people. There's a bit of that cognitive dissonance that goes along with that, that does not sit well with. There are very few folks where I find that sits well. So I'm not surprised. And I have to say that as a professor in the classroom, one of the things I'm trying to get my students to do is to unlearn. Forget what you knew as you came into this program or this class. Like, let's use AI as a partner. Focus in on the creativity, right? Like iteration, writing a paper, those things you can have help on. So being able to give yourself space to explore, no matter where you are, no matter what your role, no matter what you're doing, doesn't matter if you are a second grader or if you're an executive, like giving yourself the space to go, I'm going to explore something new and something uncomfortable is, to me, that first step. The second thing that I would highlight for just any individual is go, okay, what is one thing that I can do each day that feels completely scary to me? And the reason why is we need to start to incorporate that stress into our daily lives. And if for some reason you're having analysis paralysis and it feels too big, then I say, great. In the context in which you are aware of that, it could be you're in a cafeteria. It could be that you're out getting coffee. It could be that you're in a meeting on Zoom. What's something that you're fearing within that context that even if it's small, you're still putting yourself in that position. Maybe it's saying something that you wouldn't normally say to a person that you wouldn't normally say it. Maybe I know that people have become more fearful of going outside. So
Yeah,
maybe,
no, that's true. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's a huge thing. So maybe it's okay, I'm going to go for a walk in my neighborhood. And it doesn't have to be out, out in the woods or amongst people, or finding those social spaces, because you don't even need to go to an event or join a club. How can you force yourself to even go get a cup of coffee or go out to dinner? We don't do these things anymore. I walk into a coffee shop and it doesn't matter if it's a small one or, say a large franchise, they are pretty much empty. And so how do you force yourself to head into maybe some of those social situations? So that's the next piece, is finding where you can really get yourself a little uncomfortable so that you're providing stress into your life, and you are expanding out sort of that circle that you've created for yourself. And then I'd say that the third thing, and this can be particularly within an organization, but it doesn't matter what level you're on, start scanning the horizon. Where are you starting to see shifts occur that maybe you yourself can leverage, maybe the organization can leverage? How are you, let's just utilize technology. Like, how are you utilizing, we'll use Gen AI within your workflows? Is Gen AI a partner in your governance structure? Is Gen AI a decision maker of any kind? Are you using it to become, say, more productive and remove some of those mundane tasks that really no one wants to do, but ends up on our laps anyway? What are ways in which you can incorporate Gen AI in that way? So you're looking and you're zooming out, as John Hagel, as I affectionately remember, would say, and you're also zooming in. So what's happening on the horizon, but then also what can you do and implement today? But as you're doing those things and as you're starting to scan and identify patterns, you're also going, great, how can I lean into what seems really scary as I even scenario plan, whether it's for myself or for our organization, and start to identify those common threads amongst those scenarios? Because it doesn't matter whether or not you are thinking of a scenario that seems very dystopian or even one that is utopian, there are commonalities that your brain is going to immediately incorporate into both. And and that those data points are coming from somewhere. So yeah, identify where those data points are, how they're incorporating themselves into those scenarios, and then what can you tease out and synthesize for yourself and for your organization to go, great, I think I need to do more research around this, or maybe we need to explore X, Y, and Z. But there's something here, and I might not be able to put my finger on it per se. I'm collecting my own signals, if you will, and starting to make sense of what the future might look like for me and or for my organization.
Yeah, one of the things we do in the studio, was sharing a little bit of this before, is every week we have our team call, and half of it is really dedicated towards people sharing how they're using these tools to make their work, cheaper, better, more effective. And every week it sort of blows my mind, like we had our CFO presenting this week, and he's talking about everything from how when we create companies in the studio, we automatically automate cap tables, data rooms, design docs, everything is just like spun out. Now, he would even say himself, it gets to about the 70% mark, right? There's always nuances depending on the type of business that you're creating, or maybe you're setting it up in Nevada instead of Delaware, or whatever it might be. But, he's one of these people who would say, if you have this sort of base expertise in the domain, the ability to create the output and then iterate it is quite exceptional for the time it would have taken them before. Right. And similarly, the engineers show us using tools like Cursor AI, where they rebuild products that used to take us 6 months to build, and they do it live in 5 minutes. It's like, there's stuff there that is truly amazing, and it's definitely certainly a differentiator for our venture studio, is that it's fully AI native now. We need, I would say, a quarter of the people that we thought we needed to build the 100 companies we want to create, and it's been a fascinating journey. So yeah, no, I really appreciate you just again giving people these models to think about for their own personal journey. It can feel like a bit of a mountain that you don't know where the path is or where to start. And so I think it's really important, as you're reminding us, it is going to be stressful, but that's this idea of getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's not like, you got to go look for stress. It's just that's a signal that you're growing, I always feel. And yeah, it's very helpful to hear that. The book is amazing, Super Shifts. I highly recommend people go out there, get a copy, dive into it. Lots of fascinating tools, insights, and methods that people can use to help them sort of embrace this future we're facing. And thank you very much for joining. And so, as ever, and sharing your story. I know you're already working on another book, which is again stressful. So you're living the stuff that you're talking about. So thank you very much. And we'll get you back, I'm sure, when that book comes out to share more stories from your experiences there.
Oh, Barry, thank you so much for having me. And I have to tell you, I mean, you know this, I'm a huge fan of yours. I love what you guys are doing. And I love how you're incorporating technology into actually creating this mission and realizing this mission of creating these ventures. So I can't wait until you have really reached the summit of this mountain. And yeah, anyway, thanks for having me on, and it's always a pleasure. And I know we'll chat again soon. So thanks
All right.
again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please consider leaving a rating or a review, as it helps others find our podcast. For more episode and details about the show, visit barryoreilly.com, and we'll see you on the next episode.